Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
So we're coming to the end of the historical prologue, and in particular, the historical section of the historical prologue. Chapter 4, which we'll cover in the next few classes, details Moses' preaching and exhortation to the people based on what happens in chapter 3. In chapter 2, we saw that God had already begun to give his people some of the land that he had promised to them, and he did not allow his people to settle or get involved with Edom or Moab or Ammon. Instead, he begins to conquer for them the Amorite king Sihon, and now he's going to do the Amorite king Og of Bashan. This is important. Israel's going to get some of this land, but you should be aware that Israel only is going to get land that God has conquered for them. They're not going to get to pick wherever they want to live. Yes, there is an element of choice. We'd like to stay in Bashan, these few tribes are going to say. But it's only permitted because God has conquered that land before them, and in the process of conquering that land has wiped out the inhabitants. So that land has become, as it were, safe, as it was, safe for the people of Israel to inhabit because the inhabitants have been removed. This is very important. This is going to be a key theme in the book of Deuteronomy. When you cross the Jordan and go into the land, step one is to eradicate the people who live there. Now, it's going to become more clear why. In anticipation, we know it's because those people worship in different ways. They worship false gods. They have practices that are abhorrent to the God of Israel. Now we just see that already God is starting this practice. We move in, the Lord fights for his people, and they wipe out the inhabitants, and that's a good thing. It's preparing the land for his people to move in, and at the same time, it's executing judgment on those Amorites. It's bringing judgment down on those people who hate the Lord. We talked about this at the end of last class as being an example of what some people want to call holy war. A better term would be Yahweh war. Holy war is now come into sort of modern usage as a term for war inspired by religion with the intent of wiping out people who don't believe like you do or forcibly converting them and then claiming that God told you to do it. So modern jihad, the Crusades, these are all would be examples of people would describe as holy war. But that's not what's happening in the Bible. This is not a case of Moses moving into Transjordan and saying, be Jews or we're going to kill you. Convert or you're out. At the point of a sword, forcing conversion to the God of Israel. That's not what's going on here. God is the one that's fighting for Israel. So let's begin in chapter 3, verse 1. Then we turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, with all his people, came out to meet us in battle at Edrei. They've won one victory. A new king comes out, but the Lord said to me, I key off on this contrast in verse 2. The assumption is the people were nervous. We defeated one king. Can we defeat another? But the Lord said to me, don't fear him, for I have delivered him and all his people into your hands, and you shall do to him just as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered Og also, king of Bashan, with all his people into our hands. We smote them until no survivor was left. Verse 6, we utterly destroyed them as we did to Sihon, king of Heshbon, utterly destroying the men, women, and children of every city. It's a repeat. It's defeat the Amorite kings, part 2. And just like the first part, God fights for Israel, and Israel wins. Notice that Israel is supposed to take great confidence in the Lord as a result of this victory. That's the whole point of this recitation, is to remind Israel, look, you're about to go in and face battle after battle after battle, have to defeat and kill city and people after people after people. Don't be afraid. I've done this for you in the past. If there's one sin that trips up Israel over and over and over again, most people say idolatry. But before we move into the land, the problem is unbelieving fear. That's the problem. God says, go in, you're going to face difficulties, but I'm with you, I'm going to fight for you. And they are too afraid to go in. They're too afraid to fight. And so they tend to lean on other things to take care of themselves. We have two examples, one in chapter 2, one in chapter 3. God fights for Israel, and Israel wins. And so, as a result of that victory, in verse 8, we read, thus we took the land at that time from the hand of the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon. That's almost all of Transjordan, from about the middle of the Dead Sea all the way up north past the Sea of Galilee. All that territory now belongs to Israel by virtue of the fact that God gave it to them, and then by virtue of the fact that he fought for them and exterminated all the people who were living there. It's open territory. It now becomes part of Israel's possession. Verse 13, the rest of Gilead and all Bashan, the kingdom of Og, I gave to half of the tribe of Manasseh, and all the region of Argob and all Bashan is called the land of Rephaim. We get a mention of a son of Manasseh who lives there. Verse 15, to Machir I gave Gilead, to the Reubenites and the Gadites I gave from Gilead, even as far as the valley of Arnon, the middle of the valley, as a border, and as far as the river Jabbok, the border of the sons of Ammon. Now, Moses doesn't detail the giving of this territory to these Israelite tribes. You want to remember these Israelite tribes? Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. The other half moves into the land, and they settle in the borders of Israel. But these 3 bits, these 3 people groups, get land in Transjordan. And Moses sort of passes over the fact that this was a major drama. Right? We get a hint of it in verse 18. Then I commanded you at that time, saying, the Lord your God has given you this land to possess. All you valiant men shall cross over armed before your brothers, the sons of Israel. But your wives and your little ones and your livestock, I know that you have a lot of livestock, shall remain in your cities which I have given you until the Lord gives rest to your fellow countrymen as to you. And they also possess the land which the Lord your God will give to them beyond the Jordan. Then you may return every man to his possession which I have given you. The recitation here of the story masks a very serious drama that happened back in Numbers 32. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. Numbers 32. And this was almost Kadesh Barnea number 2. It's important to notice this. This was all, Israel escaped this one. But Moses was horribly, horribly frightened at what happens in Numbers 32. Numbers 32. In verse 1 we read, now the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad had an exceedingly large number of livestock. So when they saw the land of Yazer and the land of Gilead, that is this whole region, that it was indeed a place suitable for livestock, the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben came and spoke to Moses and to Eleazar the priest and to the leaders of the congregation, saying, Atarot, Dibon, Yazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Ealeh, Sabam, Nebo, Beon, the land which the Lord conquered before the congregation of Israel, is a land for livestock, and your servants have livestock. They said, if we have found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servant as a possession. And then here come the fateful words, do not take us across the Jordan. That's dramatic. I think if Moses heard that, his mouth would have dropped open, and he would have shook his head and said, you've got to be kidding me. Not again. The last time Israel decided to not go into the land, the result was a 40-year education in the wilderness. Moses is getting old. He's still a strong guy, but he's been at this for a long time. He's been trying to get these people into the promised land, and now 3 of the tribes, after great victories against Amorite kings, decides, you know what? Maybe the grass really is greener on this side. Maybe we could stay, Moses. Do you think we could stay here? But Moses said, verse 6, but Moses said to the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben, shall your brothers go to war while you yourselves sit here? And verse 7 gives us the great conflict in his head. Now, why are you discouraging the sons of Israel from crossing over into the land which the Lord has given them? This is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. For when they went up to the valley of Eshcol, they saw the land. They discouraged the sons of Israel so that they did not go into the land which the Lord your God had given them. So the Lord's anger burned in that day, and he swore, saying, none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, for they did not follow me, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, and Joshua, the son of Nun, for they have followed the Lord fully. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years, until the entire generation of those who had done evil in the sight of the Lord was destroyed. Now behold, you have risen up in your father's place a brood of sinful men, to add still more to the burning anger of the Lord against Israel. For if you turn away from following him, he will once more abandon them in the wilderness, and you will destroy all these people. You might translate, you will have destroyed all these people by that decision. Oh man, one generation, a whole generation, gone, didn't get into the land because the first group said we won't go in. Now these other people are showing up and saying, we'd like to stay. And Moses, I think, doesn't overreact. It's not an overreaction. It turns out these people were not complaining. It turns out it's going to be okay. Their motives were pure. But Moses' reaction is an appropriate one in light of the history of this people. What happens? The people say, look, we understand. Our intention is not to stay here and keep everybody here. You guys go over and we will send our fighting men over with you. This is important. Then they came near to him and said, we will build our sheepfolds for our livestock and cities for our little ones. But we ourselves will be armed, ready to go before the sons of Israel until we have brought them to their place, while our little ones live in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every one of the sons of Israel has possessed his inheritance. For we will not have an inheritance with them on the other side of the Jordan and beyond, because our inheritance has fallen to us on this side of the Jordan toward the east. Moses said to them, if you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before the Lord for the war, and all of you, armed men, cross over the Jordan before the Lord until he has driven out his enemies before him, and the land is subdued before the Lord, then afterward you shall return and be free of obligation toward the Lord and toward Israel, and this land shall be yours for a possession before the Lord. But if you do not do so, behold, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. They make a commitment. We're going to leave our people, most likely, old men, young men, all the women and children, all the possessions, leave them alone, and we're going to go fight for you so that all of Israel can get rest together around the same time. We don't want Israel to stay in this land. We're going to go over before you. Moses sort of passes over that story quickly, acknowledging, however, that these men have made a promise, because that promise is going to be important for helping Israel win the whole land. So now we come to the end of that historical part of the historical prologue, and based on what Moses has recited to Israel in the past, he's now going to use that information to encourage their leader going forward. Notice verse 21, I commanded Joshua at that time, saying, Your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings. So shall the Lord do to all the kingdoms into which you are about to cross. Don't fear them, for the Lord your God is the one fighting for you. Joshua has been Moses' understudy for all these years. He's about to take up the reins all by himself. And Moses encourages Joshua with truth. Number one, notice what God has done in the past, Joshua. You saw it yourself. When you're in the middle of your wars against the Canaanites in the land, don't forget, you saw with your very own eyes. Your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings. Don't forget that. You saw it. Children are whiners. Mine are no less than any others. And when they get hungry, they want food right now. And I tell them, you are going to get food. Your mother is preparing food for you. I'm preparing food for you. It's coming. And they go out, and 2 seconds later, they come back. I'm hungry. I want to eat. We want food now. Do you see the pots on the stove right there? That's food for you. It's going to be here in just a few minutes. Can you wait a little bit? 2 minutes later, they're back in again. We want to eat. And at that point, I'm like Moses. I lose it. And I say, have you ever missed a meal in your whole life? Did you eat yesterday and the day before? Your own mouth tasted the food that we gave you. Do not fear. You're going to eat lunch today. Moses is using the same logic with Joshua. You're going to move into the land and you're going to be afraid. Don't forget what the Lord has done for you in the past. Your eyeballs are the ones that saw what he did. So don't be afraid. God is the one who's going to be fighting for you. Sometimes in the life of the Christian, we run into difficult situations. And we're quick to forget what God has done for us in the past. Most of you are still relatively young, and so you don't have a huge track record with the Lord. But if you sat down and listed for yourself the number of times he delivered you from whatever circumstance you were in, my guess is that list would be impressive enough to serve as a remembrance for the future. But we forget. We run into money problems. The Lord gives us a job. It's a job we like. Our money problems go away, and we forget that God's the one who gave us that job. We run into relationship problems, and lo and behold, we work hard, the other person works hard, the relationship is restored, and we move forward. And when we run into a relationship problem again, we forget, oh yeah, God solved that problem. We put more on our plate than we can possibly handle. We're way in over our head with all the work that we need to do. The time comes, it got done. We forget that it's the Lord who gave us the strength to do it. We run into that problem in the future, and we lean on our own strength. We forget, we become fearful. And when we do that, we're acting like Israel was tempted to act. And God takes steps to remind Joshua, I delivered you in the past. Don't be afraid. Don't continue in unbelieving fear. You can have confidence that I'm going to deliver you in the future. In the case of the Christian, we find that logic very strongly in Romans 8:32. Romans 8:32 is a great verse. We didn't see Christ crucified on the cross, but we've reaped the benefits of that relationship. What shall we say then to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? The logic is the same. God's provided for us in the past, most importantly on the cross. Don't be afraid. The Lord is the one who fights for you. Then the chapter ends with a sad, sad story that functions, I think, as a great warning for Israel as we move into chapter 4, which is a big section of preaching and exhortation. In verses 23 through 29 of chapter 3, Moses comes back to this pivotal event in his life by which he lost the chance to go into the promised land. And this is very, very sad. And perhaps in few other places do we see the pain and the sadness in Moses than we do right here. We read in verse 23, I also pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Let me, I pray, cross over and see the fair land that is beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon. Think about being in Moses' situation. You ran from Egypt, you lived in Midian, you came back to Egypt, you brought these people out, you carried them through the wilderness, as it were, you led them through the wilderness, and all the drama and the complaining and the whining and the rebellion. Now you find yourself in Transjordan, and God is starting to do those things he promised to do a long, long time ago. It's Christmas, and you're starting to open presents. And the first present is Sihon, and the next present is Og, and it's beautiful land. And you know that grandma's coming, and she's going to bring all the good presents. Here it comes. And you remember, oh yeah, God told me that I was not going to get into the land. And he's mentioned this once before. He's going to mention it again. It's very sad. And so Moses, right, on bended knee, comes back one more time to say, Lord, can you give me a break? I know I didn't turn the paper in. Can you let me in anyway? The event that he's referring to, which he doesn't give specifically, happened in Numbers chapter 20. You can turn there. Numbers chapter 20. It's a familiar story, and it may surprise you that this punishment that God gives Moses is so strong. I mean, kill another 1,000 Israelites, but don't keep Moses out of the land. He's your main guy. He's the main guy. Starve them for another couple years, but let Moses get into the land. Numbers chapter 20 shows us that what Moses actually did there was so bad that this punishment is probably right on. It's not overkill. Numbers chapter 20, verse 1. Then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there. Verse 2, there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. And the people thus contended with Moses and spoke, saying, if only we had died when our brothers died before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into the wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us into this wretched place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beasts drink. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded them. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he said to them, listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted up his hand, struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. You're familiar with the story maybe, and in many people's minds, the sin that Moses committed was that he struck the rock twice instead of speaking to the rock as the Lord had instructed him to do. You have charts in front of you. Micah, I'm going to borrow yours. You have charts in front of you, and if you'll lay these out, 75 on your left, 76 on your right, what you'll notice here are all of the rebellion narratives of the book of Numbers laid out chronologically. I want to use a chart like this to argue to you that, in fact, Moses' sin at the rock was the sin of misrepresenting God to the people. That is, yes, he struck the rock twice. God told him to speak to the rock. That's a problem. But the bigger problem is that God was misrepresented by Moses, who was supposed to be God's representative to the people. Notice in this chart, in chapter 11, we have the complaint at the upper left-hand side of the chart. Israel is whining. The text only tells us that they complained. The next row down answers the question, was the complaint legitimate? And the answer is no. The story doesn't give us much. It's just a few verses. But it appears whatever this complaint was, it wasn't legit. The people were just whining. The second column, Numbers 11, 4 through 34, the people whine and complain, who will give us meat to eat? And again, the complaint is not legitimate. They have food. They just don't like it, right? God's been giving them manna. They don't want manna. They want meat. They want steak. They ended up getting quail. So, complaint, not legitimate complaint. Numbers 12, Moses and Aaron and Miriam and a couple others start complaining. Is Moses the only one through whom the Lord has spoken? Hey, we want some of that authority too. Was that complaint legitimate? No. The cause was pride and ambition. In Numbers 14, why is the Lord bringing us into this land? It's scary. This is the Kadesh Barnea incident. Those villages are high. The people are stronger than us. We can't go in. Cause disobedient fear. Chapter 16, everyone is holy. Why do you exalt yourselves, the sons of Korah say? Is the complaint legitimate? No. Pride and ambition, again. The rest of 16, you are the ones who caused the death of the Lord's people, the people complain. Again, complaint legitimate? No. In all these cases, God gets angry. And you can see that in the fourth row down, characterization of God by, in 11, the narrator tells us, it displeased God. In Numbers 14, God is described as becoming exceedingly angry. In chapter 12, Yahweh's speech, come out. The glory of the Lord shows up. The narrator tells us they were speaking, but God heard them. In Numbers 14, God says, I will strike them down. In Numbers 16, separate yourselves. I will destroy them at once. Again in Numbers 16, get away from the congregation that I may consume them instantly. Go now to Numbers chapter 20, the first column where the header is in white. And here's what you notice right away. Yes, the people complain. Why have you brought us into this wilderness? Is the complaint legitimate? The answer is yes. The people don't have any water. They need, this is not like we want to eat meat. They had food. They just didn't want the food that God gave them. In this case, they really did need water. Now, their attitude was not right. They came whining and complaining instead of asking and trusting, but they really did have a genuine need. How does God respond to their complaint? Does he respond with, back off, Moses, here comes the lightning bolt, or step aside, here comes the earthquake, or I'm going to plague the people? No. He tells Moses and Aaron, come, speak to the rock, and give them water. That's it. God's not angry. He's not furious. He's not going to punish them. He says, my people need water. I'm going to use you, Moses, to give them water. But what does Moses do? Moses comes out full guns blazing. You rebels, should we give you water? Smacks the rock. He wanted to smack that dude over there. He smacks the rock instead, and water comes out. Now, understand what's happening here. God is in the tent of meeting. The people don't get to talk to God, right? Who talks to God? Moses goes in, talks to God, and when he comes out of the tent and talks to the people, what do the people assume Moses is telling them? Exactly what God said to tell them. Moses, in some ways, is God to the people because they can't talk to God. Moses comes out, God said to do this. God's not happy with you. God's going to plague you. And the people say, oh, that's what God said. In this case, God said, Moses, give him water. And Moses comes out and says, fine, there's water for you. That was not what God had done in the tent. And so Moses has misrepresented God to the people. He treated God as if God were just like him, somebody prone to get angry and fly off the handle in a difficult situation. Had God judged the people in the past? Yes. Had the people deserved it in the past? Yes. But in this case, they really needed some water. And God intended to give them water, but Moses instead represented God as being angry, and that was not right. He did not treat God as holy before the people. And so, he and Aaron are punished with an extreme punishment. You're not going to get into the land. You're going to lead the people right up to the door, but you're not going to get into the land. To give Moses a break, if I were in his shoes, I would have done the same thing. You're coming to me again? That job didn't get done again? Yes, I know you had some other thing to work on. Again? But it's no excuse for God's representative. And so he doesn't get into the land. And in Deuteronomy chapter 3, he begs and he pleads, and God's response is startling. Verse 26, but the Lord was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, enough. Speak to me no more of this matter. Moses, I'm not talking to you about this anymore. It's done. Obviously, it's not done for Moses because he mentions it one more time. It's your fault that I'm not getting into the land. It's very painful for the leader of this people. God is kind. Moses is not going to get in, but he gives him a chance to see the land that Israel is going to get. Verse 27, go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes to the west and north and south and east and see it with your eyes, for you will not cross over this Jordan. You're going to get a chance to see it. I can see Moses at the top of Mount Pisgah with one of those little binocular things you drop a quarter in, and he's looking at that land, and the tears are coming down his face. They are at once tears of joy because God's going to give his people this great land, and they are at the other hand tears of sadness that he's not going to get in. It's a reminder, I'm going to argue, for the nation. Even someone as great as Moses has to do what's right, has to be an accurate representative of the Lord, has to obey, or there will be consequences. Israel had 3 leaders coming out of Egypt: Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and none of them made it in. Lest any of the children of Israel think to themselves, we'll get by. Just remember Moses. Even Moses didn't get into the land. Do you think, Israelite, that you're going to get away with disobeying the Lord? No way. Remember the victory over Sihon and Og? But also remember that God will do what's right each and every time, even if that means punishing his greatest follower along this great trek. The reminder to us as Christians is very, very significant. We tend to think, God loves me. He's going to be gracious and merciful. And yes, that's true. And in Christ, he has been gracious and merciful. And he continues to be gracious and merciful to us. But don't think for a minute, just because you are a believer, you are in the family of God, that you have the right to disregard his commands and his plans for your life. You can't do it. Moses didn't get into the land. Moses had a relationship with God like no other, better than any of the ones that we have in some ways. And he did not get into that land. It's a motivation for us as believers to fight sin more strongly every day. If God judges sinners, if God judges unbelievers, does he not hold Christians, those who claim to represent him in the world, to a higher standard? Go to the top of Pisgah, take a look at what you see, but charge Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he's the one that's going to cross at the head of this people. He will give them an inheritance, the land which you will see. So we remained in the valley opposite Beit Peor. The chapter ends on a bit of a sad note, and yet with a forward look. Moses doesn't get in, but God encourages him, yea, commands him to encourage Joshua. Israel is not going to be left leaderless. Joshua will take the people over and give them the inheritance that God promised.